First of all, thank you for having me, and I wish a Ramadan Kareem to all of Muslims around the world, and to all the Christians for Lent. Uh, Based on your question, the I think the thing that is most important to realize with President Trump and his administration is that he is not specifically looking for war. So he is, in my estimation, trying to find the best way to ensure that the negotiations are successful based on his criteria. The question is, what is his criteria? It seems like the most important angle is the nuclear file, but there's a lot of other people whispering in his ear, to name one in particular, which would be the Prime Minister of Israel, talking about the ballistic missiles as well as the allies in the region, like you mentioned, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Shia militia groups in Iraq. So this collection of parties in the Middle East that Iran supports is an issue that Israel has asked the United States to put on the table. For the United States, the priority is the nuclear arsenal. And I believe that what the president and what the U.S. administration is doing right now is gaining leverage through the threat of force. And I think that their goal, whether they intend to use force or not, and I think that that's very much on the table, is to get this issue resolved as quickly as possible. I think one of the things that we forget is that when the president pulled out of the JCPOA negotiation or the agreement from 2015, one of the reasons was because he wanted to do things differently than President Obama. So now to come to an agreement that matches or is similar to what the JCPOA agreement looked like is almost certainly unacceptable. So I think when we look at what the negotiations are and where the floor is for the United States, the most important thing would be to see where it was left with JCPOA and what he found unacceptable, and assume that the position is going to go from there. And that means either significantly curbing the nuclear capability or ending it entirely. And the question, I think, for Iran is if, in fact, their goal is to have a nuclear capability simply for civilian energy purposes, is the cost of what's happening worth it to them? I don't think it is, but that's a question for them. I do think so, because I think that the Iranian regime is on its heels. It's feeling pressure both from within, as we saw with the massive demonstrations. And I think one of the things that people need to be mindful of when we look at the demonstrations, this is the first time that the demonstrations brought both the civil society advocates as well as the economic protesters, meaning the bazaris, the merchants, that brought them together. And so for the first time, Iran was feeling pressure from all sides within Iranian society. And as we saw, Iran took some significantly horrific measures to put down the protests. And I think they're aware that this is a factor, and it continues to be a factor. And it's certainly a reflection on their popularity within Iranian society. 90 million people, maybe 20% back the regime. So there is a sense of urgency, I think, also for Iran, both in the context of what is happening domestically, and then also because they're feeling pressure from all of the region. They are also using the region to try to push back on the United States. So, for example, when Ali Khamenei said, and I think it might be for the first time that he said it specifically, that if a war were to break out, it would affect the entire region. His message, I believe, is intended to encourage the Gulf countries and other neighbors to put pressure on the United States. And I think he's doing so because he feels the pressure. He understands that he doesn't have very many options available to him. And for the United States, I think the speed with which they want to complete these negotiations is very typical of what we've seen of this administration. President Trump likes to be known as a deal maker. He likes to move in fast, make it splashy, do something that catches people's attention, and achieve a successful outcome. But he wants to do it quickly, which I think also reflects on how the administration might be thinking about the military buildup and to what extent they might be willing to engage in conflict. My estimation is that the Trump administration would like to do, if they were going to do a strike, would like it to be quick, targeted, and achieve a particular goal. And I think then they would like to get out, because I know that for everything that the president has said, he does not want to get bogged down in another long-term conflict. So the timing really, this expedited timing, I believe it fits both of their perspectives, both the United States and the Iranians. You make a very good point, Rabah, that there is a distinction. I think the Iranian regime feels pressure to move quickly, but I think their preference, as you correctly point out, is to make this last as long as possible, because it's in their interest. They recognize, given that the U.S. system means the president has essentially 3 more years left, in their perspective, it's better to wait this out. If they can concede on some elements of what the United States is looking for, but not give in entirely, from their perspective, that would be a victory. My thought, though, is I don't know that the Trump administration is going to let them drag it out for an extended period of time, partly because the Trump administration also recognizes that, well, 3 years seems like a long time in terms of what the U.S. could commit to. It's not. And so I think he wants to get a deal done as soon as possible. Also, within the context of U.S. domestic politics, we have to keep in mind that with the upcoming midterm elections in November, now we're talking essentially 9-10 months, that the U.S. administration also feels a bit of pressure. So it's not just 3 years, it's actually just 9 months before things could change dramatically. And we've seen how this administration engages with the legislative branch in the United States. Their preference is to avoid having to deal with them as much as possible. And it seems like so far it's worked for them, but the legislative branch is definitely going to push back. And I think his concern is if something doesn't happen within these next few months, the administration's hands could be tied going forward, depending on the outcome of the midterm elections. That is a really good question, and I think that's one of the big challenges for this administration. One of the unique aspects of President Trump's image and his ability to engage with foreign partners is he gives this impression that he will do what he wants. And I think people recognize that. And so there is a bit of this sense that if he feels like this is going to be good for the United States and maybe for his administration, he's going to move forward. He certainly is mindful of where his allies are on this, and he's heard from them, I'm certain, multiple times, to include the visit of the Prime Minister of Israel most recently to the United States. There's no question that he sees many of the other partners trying to facilitate negotiations, Oman, of course, but the Qataris, the Turks, the Egyptians, everyone's involved because there's a sense that conflict in the region is going to be bad for everybody. So he hears those voices. And I think in some respects, that's very consistent with what he envisions of this. He wants a negotiated settlement, but he wants a settlement that's going to fit his demands. If he doesn't get it, I suspect there's almost a assuredness that there's going to be a military strike. But what does that look like? It's probably going to be somewhat constrained because I don't think that the administration, and we've heard this from many of the representatives of the administration, they're not looking for regime change. They're looking for a change in attitude and a change in the way the Iranian regime acts and operates in the region. And that actually may not be as hard to achieve as full-on regime change. Israel would prefer regime change. Israel wants to ensure that in the negotiations, the United States includes discussions about ending the ballistic missile program. And then, as we discussed, they also want to end Iran's support for many of these parties. I think he hears that. I think he supports that in principle. But I suspect that the goal of achieving a successful end to the negotiations on what we've always said was our priority, which is the nuclear file, is probably going to drive him. And then maybe on the side, they'll figure out how they can incorporate some of these other threats. Because at the end of the day, I think everybody recognizes that Iran's influence is not its nuclear program. Iran's influence is its ballistic missiles, which are the threat to many of the neighbors, and these groups that have threatened actively many of their neighbors, of Iran's neighbors. So I think at the end of the day, that's where the pressure is going to be for some resolution, but it may not fit within the confines of this negotiation. I think that the Iranian government uses, and this is just my opinion, but I think the Iranian government uses international law when it suits it, because clearly Iran has violated a number of international legal principles, not the least of which is what it did to thousands of its citizens and what it does in its interference with numerous countries in the region. So when it suits its purposes, yes, it talks about using international law and saying that the United States is flouting international law. This U.S. administration tends to do things its own way. And so I don't know that this should be a surprise that they're going to continue doing things their own way and that they're going to stay within the framework of international law, but they might push it to its boundaries. Iran is saying this, and it's a great argument for some people who already support the regime to hear that, well, we're asking for something that is within the laws of the international community. Yes, but everything else you're doing does not support that. And I also think that the issue really at hand is, again, if their goal is to use nuclear energy for civilian purposes, why would they have gone through all of these years of sanctions and understanding that no one is supportive of this effort if they could have gotten energy in a different way? And it makes me think back to what happened with Saddam Hussein during the war or the U.S. invasion in the early 2000s. He was not going to tell anyone that he didn't have nuclear weapons or biological weapons or chemical weapons. He wanted people to believe that because when you're a dictatorial regime, your strength is everything. And if you look weak to your neighbors, then you're in trouble. And his calculus was, I might be able to survive a U.S. attack, but I can't survive looking weak to my neighbors. And I wonder if this nuclear aspiration for the Iranians has something to do with their fear that the neighborhood would turn on them if they didn't have nuclear weapons or would be more of a threat. But I think what you're seeing from most of the Gulf neighbors, certainly, and others, is that they all want to work with Iran. They just don't want Iran to be disruptive, which it has been, and they don't want Iran to be a threat. And Iran has used its proxies, if I can use that term, to threaten Saudi Arabia, to threaten the UAE, to threaten Israel. I think that's really the crux of the issue. I think based on some of the statements we saw yesterday from after the end of the discussions from the Iranian foreign minister and others within the Iranian negotiating team, that the framework for discussion has been laid out and established, and both parties are going back and offering their thoughts so that there could be an attempt to bring them closer together. I actually think that's quite positive. And again, I think it's reflective of what the U.S. has said repeatedly. Secretary Rubio said this even the other day. The United States wants negotiations to be successful. I think that's almost a certainty that their preference is not war. But this administration in particular would not shy away from some kind of armed conflict, not a full-on war, I don't think, but some kind of armed conflict that will move things in its favor when we're talking about negotiations. So Iran knows this. And I think when we go back to the question about timing, I think that's why Iran feels the pressure on timing too, because they know that the United States wants this to happen. And if it doesn't, they can't drag it out for very long, because President Trump, I think also, he thrives on the idea that no one really knows what his next move is. If you ask someone who's analyzing him, well, what do you think the U.S. will do? Well, they might do this based on past precedent. But really, we don't know for sure, because he could do just about anything. And he's proven that on multiple occasions. And I think that's part of the image that he has sought to create. And I think it's extremely effective in these circumstances. I know for a fact that no party wants conflict outside of the two principal parties. I think everyone else, except for maybe Israel, is thinking that conflict is going to be bad. What we've seen with certainly the Gulf countries, and I think Saudi Arabia is a prime example of this, how they've changed their outlook from the beginning days of Mohammed bin Salman and his when he became crown prince, when he was a bit more aggressive in his foreign policy. And what you've seen now is an outlook toward Vision 2030 and an economic development project and effort that cuts across the entire region. Everyone sees the benefit of economic development, improving the life of the citizens in their countries. And I think everyone also recognizes that war is going to set everything back. And for those countries in the neighborhood, even though they've said on multiple occasions that they're not going to permit overflight from their countries if Israel was to strike, or if the United States needed overflight, because they want to remain somewhat impartial. I don't think Iran is going to look at them that way. There are U.S. bases in many of these countries. The United States has an extremely close relationship with many of these countries. And I think if Iran feels it's an existential threat, which means a threat to both the supreme leader and certain members of the IRGC, I think what you'll see is a regional crisis. And I don't think the region can really withstand that, because most of the region outside of the Gulf suffers from financial problems. They suffer from other issues because the region hasn't evolved enough economically to be able to withstand something like this. And I think everyone recognizes that. Yes, and I think that's exactly why when we talk about what a war could look like, it's going to be constrained because of what the question that you just asked. But I think more to the point, the way I believe the administration views what happened in Venezuela and what could happen with a quick strike or some type of targeted tactical strike in Iran is an immediate victory. Because we did not go to war with Venezuela, we achieved a form of success, a very visible, a very radical success, if you will, because I don't think anyone's ever gone and kidnapped a sitting president before. So I think that's something that this administration thrives on. I think this is the kind of message that they're sending. You're absolutely right. They do not want to be entangled in war. I don't think they see this as war. I think what happened in Venezuela for them was a military success. And I think the thinking behind the buildup in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Gulf is to have a similar type of success. Now, of course, they would not, I don't believe, would be able to do what they did in Venezuela, but I think that there's plans, I'm certain, of how they could do something tactical that would really shift the way the Iranians are responding. And so I think absolutely war is a complicated thing, and one that the president has very clearly stated he would like to avoid. But conflict and short-term conflict, I actually think he feels like he can use that to his advantage. I mean, we look back and during his first administration when he assassinated Qasem Soleimani, that could have led to a broader conflict as well. And for many people, I think that's what they were expecting. And it did not. And that's, I think, has renewed his faith in his strategy that he can do these quick strikes and achieve a success that fits his vision of what he wants to have accomplished. I don't know if this strategy for the United States or for this administration is going to be successful, but what I think is happening is that the United States this administration has changed the dynamic between the United States and many of its traditional partners. So normally our very close relationship with our European counterparts, I think he's strained those relationships a bit. He's definitely pushed back on the United Nations as a broader organization. So I think this is very consistent. He seeks victory where he feels like it's him. He was the reason for the victory. Now, if you think back to the 12-day war that Israel and Iran were fighting, the United States joined at the very end with a dramatic bombing of a nuclear site or multiple nuclear sites, and then said, we did it. We won. Everything's good. Now let's go home. And I think that's very consistent with his approach. And so it's not unexpected that he would be doing this alone or unilaterally and pushing away many of our traditional partners, or as part of the international order, pushing institutions away. Again, I'm not sure that ultimately that's going to be a successful recipe, but that's not surprising based on the way this administration has conducted itself and the things that we've heard from the president in the past about how he prefers to try to deal with these things. And so again, if we thought about then what President Trump really wants, he wants a victory. And a victory means that the Iranian regime concedes in negotiations and gives the president what he wants. That's what he's aiming for. And how that ultimately looks, I'm not entirely sure. But I think that's really what he's going for. And I think it would complicate things from his perspective to have other parties actively involved in the negotiations. He just wants it to be the United States and Iran, and he wants ultimately to be able to claim victory. I don't know exactly. I think it could be one of several reasons. One, it could be a strategy. It could be much like we see here in the U.S., they flood the zone. The idea being throw a lot of things at them and then they don't know which one to say no to. So then it's too much. And I think maybe the U.S. is saying, okay, here's all the things we want. And we're going to rapid fire send those your way. And then Iran, it's like, whoa, slow down. I don't know which one you really want me to focus on. But it also could be a reflection of how the administration's thinking about this and whether they fully thought through all of the parameters. I don't know for certain, but I wonder if, given that the U.S. administration, like we just talked about, wants to go this alone, how much are they influenced by outside voices? What is the U.S. administration's ultimate goal? It seems to me that the ultimate goal is the nuclear file. These other issues, to include the protesters, could be part of that, but I think we've seen that the president makes a threat and then backs off because he's really still focused on the nuclear file. So I think it's consistent, again, with the way his strategy has been, but I don't know if it's because he's doing it intentionally or it's just it's what they're seeing at the present and they react to it. I still maintain, though, that the nuclear issues for the United States and this administration in particular is going to be the primary focus. And these other factors, while very important, may be a bit secondary. They'll still come up, and that's the question for Iran is how do you deal with that? Because the White House and the administration will bring those issues up. But what does the White House really want? And I think they still want to get this nuclear deal done. It's a very difficult situation for Iraq right now. As we've seen, the United States is putting pressure on the Iraqi government, in particular after the elections, previous elections, where the Shia party that is now looking to name a prime minister is bringing back a name from the past, Nouri al-Maliki, who has, let's just say, a reputation that isn't very positive here in the United States. And the reaction from the administration was pretty direct. It was effectively, if he's the next prime minister, then we're going to cut off support. And the support, I think, really looks, and it comes in a number of different ways. The United States provides, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million in aid a year to Iraq at various levels. But one of the key elements is the revenue from their oil sales pass through the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. And I think if the United States wants to put pressure on Iraq, there's a number of ways that they can from an economic standpoint. Also, given our history now with Iraq, I think it's pretty clear if, as an American, we want Iraq to be successful. And what we're seeing is the influence from Iran into Iraq has been a key source, not the only reason, but a key source of Iraq's inability to fully develop and flourish since the end of the war and since the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime. And we've seen Iraq go through a number of terrible periods, very difficult. And I think Iran and their hand in the Iraqi system and the governance has been a big factor in that. And so what the United States is saying now to Iraq is, you can't have direct Iranian influence in your affairs and think you're going to be successful, because it's been proven. And I would say, as someone who's seen the region and what Iran has done in the region over the decades, every country, I think without exception, that Iran has had significant influence in has either been a failed state or close to a failed state. I mean, we look at Yemen. Iran's very much involved in what's happening in Yemen, and Yemen is suffering dramatically. Iraq has gone through, as we discussed, terrible periods. Syria and the Bashar al-Assad regime, also a civil war that lasted a decade. Lebanon, again, a perfect example of how Iranian influence has led to the failure of the state. And I think that's part of Iran's agenda, is to influence and weaken the state itself so that they can increase and expand their influence. And by doing so, ultimately they just want to have control, regional dominance, and they don't care about the people in these states. And I think that's why, if I was thinking about what's the biggest issue that should be on the table, I would say it's Iran's influence in the region. I'm less worried about its nuclear program, because I don't know that they've been threatening a nuclear weapon for years. And we all know that they're very close to a nuclear weapon. And I don't know that that's going to change how we deal with one another. But what they're doing to all these other countries, I think, is a tragedy. And that, to me, is what we should really be focused on. Yeah, I think what we need to see is for each of these countries to, I think we could look to them to provide support, at least even if it's in a verbal way, just to support what the U.S. is trying to do in these negotiations. But more importantly, what these countries need to do is look inward and look at their governance and see how they can strengthen their governance ability internally while directly minimizing the influence of Iran. So Iraq is a great example. What the Shia parties need to do is to decide how much influence they want Iran to have in the way that the Iraqi government's formation will be and what will happen going forward. The greater the influence, the less likely that Iraq is going to find success with many of its other neighbors, and particularly with its Western partners like the United States. Lebanon, another example. Hezbollah has been pressuring the central government. And we talk about issues like sovereignty and how these countries really need to take control of their own sovereignty. And what defines sovereignty for many of these countries? It's the ability to control the use of force. It's the ability to make the decisions about peace and war. And I would say that Iraq and Yemen and before Syria and now Lebanon still don't have that ability. So what you need is governments that reestablish their control. And it's not that they have to be dictatorships. They just have to be able to do what a traditional government does, which is take control of weapons and provide services to your people, and do so in a way that's transparent, which means raising revenue through taxation, et cetera. But I think what you see are weak governments, and Iran taking advantage of those. And so I think the way to push back is to strengthen those central governments so that they can withstand Iranian pressure. And that's going to be difficult because it's been so deeply rooted. And part of the problem, if I could call it a problem, or the challenge, is that in several of these countries, the Shia majority still feel some allegiance to Iran. Lebanon is a great example. When Hezbollah has basically said they're an arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, there's another party, the Amal Party. They don't see it that way. They're a Shia party that's Lebanese. And there's a bit of a distinction. And I wonder if we in the West and we in the region can help make that distinction even more clear. You can be a Shia or a Sunni or a Christian, but you should be part of your country and not part of Iran. And I think that's the message that we're trying to convey to these different countries. Yes, I think that's right. I think that this administration has a vision, but maybe sometimes the vision gets clouded by different factors. And so you hear different voices saying things that maybe aren't always consistent. And you're right. I think that creates, it could be tiring, and it's adding a lot of burden to what this administration is trying to do. Because I think if we just break it down to its barest, the decision to pressure Iran and to try to resolve this nuclear file is a very good decision. I think it's the right thing to do. I think this issue needs to be resolved. And I'm not saying we need to change the regime in Iran, but I'm saying that what Iran is doing right now in a global and regional sense shouldn't be acceptable. And so I think what the administration sees is most important is how does it get that done? Are they always consistent in what they say and how they include or don't include their partners? No. That's something that we've grown accustomed to with this administration, that we don't always know what the next move is and how well thought out the next move is. But we know that the president, at least in their stated goals, I think it's spot on. I mean, I think what we really need to do is look at how we can deal with this Iran issue. And from my perspective, again, it is the nuclear file, but it's these other issues as well. And how does that happen? Do we need other partners? I think so. I mean, the best way to do it is to ensure that you have a global coalition that is of like-minded countries that sees that the issue needs to be taken care of. And with that kind of pressure, you can make changes. But if Iran thinks that the U.S. is on one side and the European countries are on another, or that the Gulf countries might think of things differently, maybe they can exploit that. And so I think it's to the best interest of this administration to ensure that all of the like-minded countries, who I'm pretty sure most of them share the same views about Iran as a threat, think about together, how do we deal with it with one voice so that we put the maximum amount of pressure on the Iranian regime. As we talked about with its international partners, having Congress support and authorize military action as as the Constitution, as it's supposed to happen, I think would be the right move for sure. Because if the president or if the administration feels that it has to do a strike of some sort, the risk, and I think we've all seen this, is a miscalculation, some type of misunderstanding, some response from Iran that goes too far, and it causes a snowball effect where the situation gets worse and worse. And we find ourselves, when initially we said we don't want a war, we don't want a full war, but we were going to do a quick strike, all of a sudden now we're finding ourselves in a war. And that war won't just include us, it'll include our partners in the region, neighbors of Iran, etc. And so if you're going to take any military action as an administration, I think it's best to make sure that the United States as a whole and all of its legal authorities are behind those decisions. Because I don't know that even if we think we can control all the various machinations that could play out, I don't think we can. And so knowing that anything's possible once you start a conflict, even if you hope that it's just 12 days or 2 weeks or whatever it might be, we don't know. And so I think for the administration, that would be the best move. Will they do that? Based on what we've seen, it's not clear to me. If they were going to do it, it'd be preferred for them to do it now while the Republicans still have a majority in the House and Senate. If things change after the midterms, these types of actions almost certainly the administration would then go alone, because they wouldn't want to go back to a Congress that they know is going to be against them. So this might be their time if they were going to do that. I don't know how, well, I can't say for sure how they view that and whether they even think that's yet necessary or not, but I think it would make the most sense. Those are two different perspectives within the administration. I wonder if ultimately both of them will win out, where I think that the desire for negotiations to be successful are absolutely true and valid, and I think the administration has made that clear. But I don't think that the administration feels like it has or it wants to give Iran a lot of time. Maybe, and there may be other reasons that I'm not aware of, but I think that this administration also sees that Iran isn't a traditionally honest partner or a negotiating partner. So I think that if they don't feel like progress is being made, then they're going to put a deadline. And they're going to say, look, I mean, they have one aircraft carrier, a second coming to the region. I don't know how much that costs, but I suspect that when you do that the goal isn't just, it could be just to be intimidating, and that would work, but there's probably going to be something that comes of that. And I think that's their message, is we're going to have to set a time and something's going to happen. So my sense is, yes, negotiations, definitely negotiations, but I don't think they're going to allow that to go on for an undetermined period of time.